It's just before dawn on the American West Coast, late 1942. The sky over the bay is black, but the shipyard below is blazing white with floodlights. Cranes are swinging. Sparks from 100 welders fall like orange snow. Steam curls into the cold air. And in the middle of all that chaos, a ship is being born. Not over months, not over a year, right now. If you froze the clock and asked any pre-war naval architect how long that should take, you'd hear the same answer. 230 days, maybe more. That's just how long a ship takes. But the clock in this yard says something else. Day 4, hour 96. A 14,000-ton Liberty ship is almost ready to slide into the water. How did that happen? How do you compress 230 days of this is how we've always done it into 4 frantic days and nights? And what kind of mind looks at a steel cargo ship the way a child looks at a box of toy blocks? If you've never heard of the toy block fleet before, you're not alone. We remember the battleships, the aces, the generals. We don't often remember the man in a hard hat and a wool coat with a carpenter's pencil behind his ear, standing in the rain at 3 in the morning, staring at a wall of prefabricated steel and thinking, we're not building a ship, we're assembling one. So let's go back a bit. Because to understand why building one ship in 4 days mattered, you have to understand what was happening out at sea while the sparks were flying in that yard. Out across the Atlantic, ships are dying. Grain ships that took months to build. Tankers full of fuel, torpedoes, trucks vanishing in seconds. German U-boats called it the happy time. They were cutting Allied supply lines to pieces. In 1942 alone, they sank more than 1,000 Allied merchant ships. Some nights entire convoys disappeared. Winston Churchill would later write that the only thing that ever really frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. Here's the awful math. It took less than a minute for a torpedo to break a cargo ship's back. It took 200 days or more to build a replacement. So I want you to imagine you're in Washington or London looking at the numbers on the wall. Ships lost this month. Ships built this month. With every red mark, Britain edges closer to starvation. Factories in the Soviet Union go idle for lack of American trucks and fuel. Troops in North Africa count crates like misers because the next convoy might not make it. How do you fight that? How do you attack a problem where the enemy is under the water, but the real battle is being lost on the calendar? The answer, in the end, wasn't another destroyer or a miracle weapon. It was a mindset. And it arrived at the shipyards in the form of men like Henry J. Kaiser, and the foremen, engineers, and carpenters he dragged in behind him. Before the war, Henry Kaiser wasn't a shipbuilder. He built things on land, roads, dams, massive construction projects that left behind concrete and steel, not wake and spray. He thought in terms of schedules, workers, and materials, how to move all three in careful patterns so a project finished on time or ahead of it. If you've ever seen photos of the Hoover Dam, you've seen Kaiser's world. Thousands of workers, modular forms, everything broken into pour here, cure there. A choreography of concrete. But the Navy's world, that was different. A ship to them was almost sacred. You started with a keel, that long spine of steel laid carefully down in the slipway. You blessed it, photographed it, shook hands over it. Then you built up, plate by plate, frame by frame, like a cathedral on its side. Master shipwrights walked the skeleton and tapped plates with hammers, listening to the ring of the steel. Riveters pounded hot rivets by hand. Everything had an order, a ceremony, a feel that lived in calloused hands and experienced eyes. If you'd walked into one of the older yards in 1938 and said, "What if we just build all the pieces somewhere else and slap them together like blocks?" you'd have been laughed straight back out through the gate. And that's where our second character walks in. Not a famous name you learn in school, not an admiral or a politician. Let's call him Frank Carter. Frank was a carpenter before the war, the kind of man who could look at an empty lot and see a house in his head. He built warehouses, cheap prefabricated housing, anything that needed to go up fast and hold together. To him, a building was never one thing. It was pieces, wall sections, trusses, stair modules, doors you hung by the dozen in a day. You didn't build a house brick by brick, one at a time, waiting on yesterday's work to dry before you started tomorrow's. You broke it into parts, built as much as you could in parallel, and then assembled it. That's what brought Frank to the yard. Kaiser needed foremen and planners who understood that kind of thinking, people who could look at a blueprint and see not just the finished shape, but how to slice that shape into chunks a crane could lift and a rookie could weld. When Frank walked into his first shipyard, the smell hit him, hot steel oil smoke. He watched a crew laying a keel, carefully adjusting wooden blocks, checking levels. Compared to a construction site, it felt slow, ritualized. Some of the older men shook their heads at the new wave of workers arriving with him. Office clerks who'd never swung a hammer, farm kids who'd never seen the ocean, women in overalls and bandanas wiping grease on their sleeves. Black workers from the South who were given the worst jobs and the lowest pay and still took them because even that was better than the cotton fields. These weren't shipwrights. They were just people, and the war didn't care. Every day a convoy left port with too few ships. Somewhere in the Atlantic, a captain stood on a storm-tossed bridge, scanning a horizon that might be hiding a periscope. So when the Navy told the new yards, 200-plus days is a good schedule for a ship like this, Henry Kaiser said something that sounded almost offensive to the old guard. No, that's too slow. We're going to do it in half the time, then half again. What would you have said if you'd been standing there? Would you have believed him? Or would you have looked at that blueprint of a Liberty ship, 441 feet long, 10,000 tons of cargo capacity, boilers, engines, deck guns, and thought, "There's no way you can treat this like a box of toy bricks"? Frank didn't laugh. He went back to his tiny office in a temporary building on the edge of the yard, a drafty cube that smelled of damp plywood, and spread out the Liberty ship plans on his desk. To most people, the blueprint was one sweeping form, a hull, a deck, a stack of cabins, a funnel. To Frank's carpenter's eye, it was something else. It was an opportunity to cut. He drew a grid over the side view of the ship, not for art, for surgery. Here from frame X to frame Y, that could be one prefabricated hull section. The bow, another. The stern, a third. Deck houses could be built as separate steel boxes, fully outfitted with wiring and doors before they ever went near the slip. The engine room, he said to one of his engineers the next morning, stabbing a calloused finger at a rectangle near the middle of the drawing. That's a block too. Build it over there in that shed. Put everything in, pipes, pumps, wiring. When it's ready, we'll drop the whole thing in like a cartridge. The engineer looked skeptical. Ships aren't houses, Frank, he shrugged. Time doesn't care. Britain's starving while we admire our traditions. Do you want to get cute about ceremony, or do you want these things in the water? It sounds harsh. It was. Because what Frank and his bosses were really saying was, we are going to strip the romance out of this craft. We are going to make it ugly, mechanical, repetitive. And that is how we are going to win. So they tore up the idea of building a ship in order. In Kaiser's yards, the ones in Richmond, in Oregon, and elsewhere along the coast, they built factories around the idea of pieces. One area for bow sections, a different line for midship hull modules, a shed for stern assemblies, another for deckhouses, steel boxes with portholes already cut, ladders welded in place, bunks bolted to the walls. You could walk past row after row of these components and never see a ship, just blocks. Metal rectangles the size of houses, sitting on stands, each one being swarmed by its own crew. Inside a bow section, welders knelt among the frames, drawing bright white lines of molten metal along the seams. In the deckhouse shed, workers installed toilets, ran electrical conduit, screwed light bulbs into sockets. Everywhere, chalk numbers. This is section A3, that's D5. This one is hull block 12. If you've ever played with a furniture kit from a big box store, all those parts labeled and sorted, you already understand the logic. The difference. Instead of an Allen wrench and a few pieces of fiberboard, this kit needed 40-ton cranes and thousands of tons of steel. Now there's a question that might be nagging at you. Isn't this just obvious? Why hadn't anyone done it before? The short answer is that shipyards were built around tradition. Their tools, their layout, even their union rules, they all assumed a certain rhythm of work. One ship, built steadily, nose to tail, with a small team of highly skilled specialists. What Kaiser and men like Frank did was deliberately break that rhythm. They brought in people who'd built dams and factories, who thought in terms of flow charts and critical paths. They asked, what can we do at the same time instead of one after the other? And maybe more importantly, what can we simplify so that a person who has never seen a ship before can still contribute on day one? That's where the toy block feeling really came in. Because suddenly you didn't need a lifetime of shipyard experience to weld a panel in Block 7 or bolt a door in Section C4. You needed a few weeks of training, a steady hand, and the willingness to work till your legs ached. That democratization of skill wasn't just a technical change. It was social. When you see black and white photos of women in bandanas and coveralls, of black and Mexican-American workers in crowded yards, this is the background. The job had been sliced so fine that thousands of untested hands could come in and, quite literally, build the arsenal of democracy. Of course, that didn't mean everyone welcomed it. If you walked into a break room in one of the older yards in those early months and listened, you'd hear the grumbling. They're throwing quality out the window. These kids don't know what they're doing. They'll get somebody killed. They want to weld everything now. Rivets have worked for 100 years. Who trusts a weld on a stormy night in the North Atlantic? They weren't entirely wrong to worry. Welding was faster and required less skilled labor than riveting, perfect for mass production, but it was still a relatively new technique on this scale. Poorly done welds could crack. Cold seas could exploit any weakness in brittle steel. And yet, the numbers rolling into the offices back in Washington told a harsh truth. If you stuck with the old ways, you were going to lose the shipping war. So in Frank's yard, the choice had already been made. He more or less lived on the site now. His wife would later say she saw him more often in the newsreels than in their kitchen. He kept a cot in the corner of his office. His desk was a chaos of coffee cups, chalk, and schedules pinned to the wall. If you'd stepped into that office in mid-1942, you'd have seen something that today looks almost like a war room from a sports movie. Along one wall, a giant board with lines and magnets. Each magnet a block of the ship, each line a timeline. Bow sections start day 1, complete day 16. Engine room modules start day 3, complete day 20. Deckhouse start day 2, complete day 14. Colored threads showed dependencies. This can't move until that is done. But this and this and this can all happen at once. Frank would stand there with a carpenter's pencil behind his ear, move a magnet 2 inches to the left, and know that somewhere out in the yard that meant an extra shift for 30 welders. Have you ever had one of those nights where you're awake at 2 a.m., spinning through worst-case scenarios in your head? That was his daily life, except his nightmares wore hard hats and carried torches. One storm could shut down the cranes. One accident could idle an entire line. One late block could jam the whole slipway like a bad gear in a clock. And over everything, like the sweep of a second hand, there was the war. Every morning brought fresh tonnage reports. Ships sunk. Lives lost. Cargo gone to the bottom of the ocean. The Liberty ship wasn't glamorous. It wasn't fast. It wasn't beautiful. Sailors joked that it looked like it had been designed by committee, a boxy hull, a straight bow, a single stack. Some called it the ugly duckling. But it could carry 10,000 tons of cargo. It was cheap. And if Frank and his colleagues were right, it could be built over and over and over again, faster than the Germans could sink them. Which brings us back to that 4-day ship. As 1942 rolled on, the yards got faster. The first Liberty ships had still taken months. Everyone was figuring it out. How to sequence the work, how to train workers, how to keep the welders supplied with rods, the cranes fueled, the steel plates arriving on time. But each launch taught them something. A block that caused trouble went back to the drawing board to be simplified. A sequence that caused bottlenecks got rearranged. By late 1942, build times had dropped to around 40 days in the best yards. That alone would have been unthinkable a few years earlier. But Henry Kaiser was a man who understood something crucial about war. Perception mattered. The Allies didn't just need ships. They needed stories, proof to their own people, and to the enemy that America's industrial engine was awake and roaring. So someone, the exact origin is still debated, floated a wild idea. What if we built one ship as fast as humanly possible? Not as a normal schedule, but as a demonstration. A stunt, yes, but a stunt that proved the principle. What if we did it in, say, under 5 days? When the idea reached Frank, he stared at the telegram for a long minute. He knew how long prefabrication really took. The blocks didn't just appear overnight. They needed weeks of work before they ever came near the slipway. Still, the idea had power. If we can show them we can assemble a ship in 4 days, he told his exhausted assistant that night, they'll understand what this really is. It's not magic, it's choreography. They chose a hull. The SS Robert E. Peary. Even the name had symbolism baked in. Peary, the Arctic explorer, a man associated with conquering the impossible. From the start, everyone knew this wouldn't be a normal build. It would be prepared like a carefully rehearsed play. For weeks ahead of time, the yard quietly stockpiled subassemblies. Hull sections were cut, framed, and partially outfitted earlier than usual, then set aside. Deckhouses were built with extra crews and parked under tarps. The engine room module was pre-fitted to a degree that would make any peacetime inspector nervous. If you're thinking, hang on, didn't they cheat? You're not alone. Even at the time, some critics said, you can call it 4 days if you want, but that's just the time in the slip. The real work was spread out over weeks. And they were right up to a point. But that was exactly the point Frank was trying to make. They weren't claiming they could conjure a ship from thin air in 96 hours. They were showing that, with the right planning, the final assembly, the part everyone could see, could be compressed into something closer to a dance than a slow-motion construction project. Launch day -4, hour 0. Under Klieg lights and with newsreel cameras whirring, workers laid the keel of the Robert E. Peary in the slipway. This was the start the world would see. Frank stood on a platform overlooking the slip, a rolled schedule in his hand, and tried not to think about how many things could go wrong. Because what followed wasn't just work, it was a relay race. As soon as the last keel section clanged into place, the first cranes started to move. From the prefab yards nearby, enormous blocks began to roll toward the slip on rail cars. Bow sections, midship hull modules, pre-built engine room. Every block wore a number in huge chalk digits. At hour 8, block 1, the bow was supposed to swing into position. Welders were assigned. Scaffold crews were in place. Electrical teams knew exactly when they'd be allowed onto the steel. At hour 12, midship section A. At hour 16, midship section B. Every movement, every weld, every inspection ticked off on a board in Frank's office, then mirrored in frantic scribbles in notebooks out in the yard. Have you ever seen a time lapse of a building going up? Walls flying into place, roofs dropping on, men swarming like ants? Imagine that, except the whole structure is 400 feet long and has to float at the end. The first day went almost too smoothly. The bow dropped in with only minor adjustments needed. The midsection married up to the keel with a fit that made the older shipwrights mutter despite themselves, just a little impressed. Crews worked under floodlights as darkness fell, moving like a small army from seam to seam. Inside the half-finished hull, the sound was like a thunderstorm. Hammers, grinders, shouted orders echoing off steel. By hour 24, the ship looked less like a skeleton and more like a vessel. You could trace the curve of her sides, walk through future passageways, duck through what would be doorways, but nothing at that speed stays smooth for long. Around hour 30, a problem. One of the hull blocks, section 7, arrived slightly out of true. Maybe the measurements in the prefab shed had been off. Maybe the rails had shifted. Whatever the cause, when the crane lowered it into place, the edges didn't quite line up. An inch here, an inch there. At normal speed, you'd shrug, send for the fitters, and take a day or two to massage the steel into agreement. On a 4-day schedule, every hour lost was a minor disaster. Out on the slip, the foremen argued over chalk lines, tape measures hanging from their belts. Frank jogged down the stairs from his platform and waded into the thicket of hard hats. "What's the spread?" he called. "3/4 of an inch at the bottom, maybe a hair more at the top," one of the fitters said, wiping sweat with a gritty sleeve. "We can make it work, but not if these press hounds want their pictures of everything going smooth." Frank looked up at the clock, then back at the cameras, then at the red-faced fitter. "Do it," he said. "Burn the overtime, borrow a crew from the deckhouse shed, whatever you need." Somewhere, a neat line on his scheduling chart just turned into a messy scribble. That's the thing people forget about miracle achievements. From the outside, they look clean and inevitable. From the inside, they are a string of compromises and improvisations, held together by coffee, adrenaline, and the stubborn refusal to admit defeat. While the hull crews wrestled with Block 7, the engine module team was racing its own demons. The engine room block for the Peary was a masterpiece of pre-fitting. Boilers, turbines, pumps, miles of cable and pipe, all crammed into a steel box designed to be dropped into the hull in one go. In the cramped shed where it sat, crew leaders argued over last-minute issues. "This valve's going to be impossible to reach once we're inside the hull. That's a worry for the boys at sea," another shot back, too tired to sugarcoat it. "Get it signed off." Harsh, yes, but remember the context. While these arguments were happening under Californian or Oregonian floodlights, ships at sea were burning. Men were dying of cold in lifeboats, watching their breath frost in the air while they waited for rescue that might not come. Was this pressure fair? No. Was it real? Absolutely. By hour 48, the Peary's hull was nearly complete. On the slip, the ship was now a long, boxy form, open along the top. Workers scurried over its decks, bare steel under their boots, while cables and hoses snaked everywhere. Under the night sky, with the yard's spotlights cutting harsh white paths through steam and smoke, it must have looked like something from another world. At that point, if you'd been allowed to walk its length with Frank, hard hat on, notepad in hand, you would have seen dozens of small stories that never made the newsreels. A woman, her gloved fingers flexing against the chill, pausing for a second to stare down the gaping cargo hold. imagining canned meat and tanks stacked to the roof beams. A black welder, hands steady despite the fatigue, laying down a bead while aware that if something later cracked in a storm, nobody in power would remember his name. They'd blame the cheap labor. A teenage boy from Oklahoma who'd lied about his age to get hired, running with a coil of cable slung over his shoulder, determined not to be the one who slowed everything down. If you've ever worked a job where you feel like a tiny, replaceable part of something enormous, you already understand the emotional texture of that moment. By hour 60, the engine room module moved. Before the cranes took the strain, there was a pause. Not ceremonial, there was no time for speeches, but practical. Chains and cables were checked. Shackles were inspected. The whole box creaked as its weight came on. Frank watched from above, his pencil finally still. "Easy," someone called over the loudspeaker. "She's worth more than all of us put together." The giant block rose inch by inch until the hull beneath seemed almost fragile by comparison. Workers inside the ship raised their arms and shouted guidance, their voices swallowed by the wind and the hum of motors. For all the planning, for all the rehearsal, for all the charts and magnets, this was the kind of moment when one faulty weld in a crane boom, one misread signal, could turn triumph into tragedy. But the boom held, the block descended. Steel met steel with a deep, resonant thud. For a second, the yard seemed to hold its breath. Then the normal noise rushed back in. Grinders, welders shouted orders. The engine room was in. The next 30-odd hours were a blur. Deckhouses came aboard, looking like strange, windowed boxes until they settled into the hull and suddenly made visual sense. The funnel module dropped in. Masts were hoisted and bolted. Inside those boxes, teams rushed to connect the arteries of the ship. Pipes married to pipes, wires to wires, valves to valves. If you've ever tried to set up a computer with too many cables and not enough space behind the desk, imagine that annoyance scaled up until a loose connection means a pump failing in a storm. By hour 96, the ship had a face. From the dock, you could see her name on the bow, Robert E. Peary. Painters had hustled to get those letters done in time for the cameras. Somewhere, a sign writer rubbed a cramp from his fingers and hoped the spacing looked right in the newsreels. Did the ship look finished in the sense a peacetime inspector would have demanded? Not even close. There were still fittings to tighten, checks to run, gear to stow, but she was whole. She could float. She could steam under her own power. And as the champagne bottle swung at her bow, as the hull began to slide down the greased ways into the water, the yard allowed itself a moment that had been denied for 4 days and nights. Pride. Floodlights reflected in wet steel and salt water. Workers who'd barely slept cheered hoarsely, some too tired to do more than wave their helmets. Newsreel cameras cranked, capturing images that would soon appear in short films shown before feature movies across America. The miracle of the 4-day ship. Later, the numbers would be parsed and argued. 4 days, 15 hours, and some minutes, depending on how you counted. Detractors would say it was a stunt. Real ships still take longer. Supporters would say maybe. But the point was never that every ship should be built that fast. The point was that the old assumptions were dead. So what did it change? Did that one launch, that one burst of speed, really matter amid thousands of hulls and millions of tons of steel? To answer that, we have to pull the camera back again, out from the glare of the Peary's launch, and look at the ocean as a whole. Between 1941 and 1945, American yards built 2,710 Liberty ships. Most of them never set a record or saw a film camera. They rolled down the ways on gray mornings to scattered applause, creaked their way into convoys, and disappeared over the horizon. Some were sunk on their first crossing, torn open by torpedoes in black water, their crews huddled in lifeboats watching the stern vanish. Some lived entire lives, and then some patched and repatched, bought and sold after the war, under flags that had nothing to do with their birthplace, finally ending in scrapyards in far-off ports. Collectively, though, they were the bloodstream of the Allied war effort. Liberty's ships carried the food that kept Britain from starving. They carried the fuel that let the RAF fly and the Red Army drive. They carried locomotives, trucks, tanks, clothing, ammunition, all the invisible, unglamorous freight without which no battlefield victory could be sustained. When American troops went ashore in North Africa, and later in Italy and Normandy, the supplies they needed to survive the first week had, in many cases, crossed the ocean in a boxy, ugly Liberty hull. You could argue with some justice that every U-boat that successfully stalked one of those ships was in a silent duel not just with the captain on the bridge, but with Frank and his scheduling board, and the men and women in those prefab sheds. If the Peary's launch proved anything, it was that the system worked. Not flawlessly, there were problems. At least 18 Liberty ships were lost or seriously damaged by brittle fractures or structural failures, especially in cold waters. Investigation after the war showed that welding, steel quality, and design all played roles. But here is where the story of the toy block fleet becomes both more human and more honest. Mass production in wartime is about trade-offs. Perfection is slow. Slowness in 1942 was deadly. When critics said, "Your ships may crack," the implicit answer was not, "No, they won't." It was, "We'll learn, we'll patch, we'll improve, and in the meantime, we'll get 10 ships in the water for everyone that sinks." Is that cruel? Yes. Is it also how wars are often won? Also, yes. Think about it this way. If you were a sailor in 1943, standing on the deck of a Liberty ship in a storm, knowing some of her sisters had broken their backs in waves, would you have cursed Frank and his toy blocks? Or would you have looked at the escorting destroyers, the other freighters in your convoy, the distant flare of a burning ship on the horizon, and thought, at least they had something to put this cargo on? At least we're not standing on a dock somewhere staring at an empty harbor because someone decided excellence on paper was better than good enough right now. History tends to polish these stories. We like clean heroes and clear villains, but the real world of the shipyards was messy. Racism and segregation were entrenched. Black workers were often kept out of the best jobs, paid less, housed in worse conditions. Women were pushed out of their positions when the war ended, their skills suddenly, temporary again once the men came home. Unions fought with management. Inspectors clashed with production bosses. Accidents happened. Men fell, were crushed, were burned. Frank, if you'd met him 10 years after the war, would probably not have given you a speech about glory. He might have told you about the night he signed off on a weld he wasn't happy about because there was no time to redo it. He might have remembered the faces of the workers who died on the job, or the telegrams that went out when a ship built in his yard vanished in the North Atlantic. But if you'd asked him, was it worth it? What do you think he'd have said? What would you have said? There's another legacy to this toy block way of thinking that goes beyond the war. Look around at modern industry. Ships are still built in modules today. If you see aerial photos of a modern shipyard, you'll recognize the scene from Frank's world. Giant blocks being welded together, cranes swinging, hulls taking shape from sections. Airplanes, too, cars, buildings. We live in a modular age, whether we notice it or not. Your phone is assembled from components made all over the world. Your car's engine probably arrived at the factory as a pre-assembled unit. The idea that you break a complex thing into manageable, parallel pieces that you design for assembly is now everywhere. The Liberty ship program didn't invent that concept, but it scaled it up under pressure in a way the world hadn't seen before. You can draw a crooked but real line from those Liberty hulls, slapped together by tired workers under floodlights, with chalk numbers scrawled on their sides, to the way we build almost everything complex today. And here's a final thought to leave you with. Somewhere in an antique store or on the shelf of an elderly veteran's home, there's likely a child's toy, a little wooden ship, blocky and simple, maybe handmade. Maybe the paint is peeling, it doesn't look like much. But in its shape, the square bow, the stubby funnel, the blocky hull, you can see the echo of the Liberty design. You can imagine a father who worked in a yard, coming home after a double shift, taking a scrap of wood and a knife and whittling something that looked like the ships he saw every day. A gift for a child who would never know the full weight of what those toy blocks really represented. If you had asked that child, "What is this?" he might have said, "A ship." If you had asked Frank, standing at his scheduling board with a pencil in his hand, he might have said, "It's not a ship yet, it's just blocks." But when those blocks were numbered, cut, welded, and launched, when they were multiplied by the thousands and sent out into dangerous seas, they became something much bigger than the sum of their parts. They became time turned into steel, time that Britain needed to survive, time that gave the Soviets trucks and gasoline, time that let American and Allied armies build up enough strength to cross oceans, storm beaches, and eventually win. So the next time you see a photograph of a Liberty ship, that awkward, boxy silhouette, or walk past a rusting freighter at some forgotten pier, maybe you'll look twice. Behind that shape is a story of carpenters and crane operators, of welders and planners, of a man who dared to treat a 14,000-ton ship like a toy block puzzle. and of a world that discovered, in the middle of its darkest war, that sometimes the fastest way to build something big is to have the courage to break it apart. Now, let me ask you one last question. In an age where we idolize sleek high-tech solutions and digital miracles, which do you think wins more wars, secret weapons, or people willing to rethink how to build the most ordinary, unglamorous things? A ship is just a box that floats, until you fill it with food, fuel, and hope, and send it into a sea full of wolves. Then it becomes something else. And sometimes, all it takes to change the course of that sea is a carpenter who looks at a warship and sees a pile of toy blocks waiting to be put together.